Again, my name is Demelissa Christe. I work with the Candler Foundry. The Candler Foundry is a public-facing program of the seminary that serves the community. We have as a mission to bring our faculty as instructors to teach and offer that knowledge, experience with everyone in the community, different denominations, local and nationwide. It'll get fixed in a minute. But also, I know that a lot of you were here in the spring when Dr. Vogue presented her course on medievalism. I've seen that because I've seen the registrations come in. And so the two things I want to tell you is one of the benefits. I know this is not your practice at Trinity to register for courses, but because part of what we do is funded by grants, then we like to report like how many people we impacted, how many people were there, how many people took advantage of those resources. So a couple of things we do is we created a course webpage. So one place where all the recordings, all the slides, all the resources that Dr. Kemp is sharing are in that one place. You should be getting emails every week with that course website to go and rewatch or review the things that he's sharing. The second advantage is you get 1 year access to our Pitts Theological Library. So Pitts has about five or six different databases that you guys would have access to research Bible Today, Ministry Today. It's like different databases that would be interesting if you want to go deeper, okay? Thank you so much for coming again, and I would leave you with Dr. Kemp for our third session.
Everyone, it's better? Awesome. It's good to be back with you all. Hope you've been enjoying our journey so far. As is always our custom, let you know our plan for the day. So we'll start, as we did in the last class, with a quick review of a few things that we looked at in our most recent class, and any lingering questions, concerns, thoughts that have been troubling your spirit and soul. I don't know if I have answers for them, but we can at least talk about them for a moment. Then we'll turn our attention to this idea of heroes and villains, and to think about kind of what makes someone a hero, what makes someone a villain. Then we'll spend the bulk of our time today looking at this question of how does Cain become kind of the first villain in biblical tradition? And his villainization, I argue, becomes ripe for racialization. And so what happens, a lot of the attributes that get assigned to Cain will quickly find their way into the American context to be assigned to those who are Black. And as the title slide suggested, Cain being the father of Black. So in many of the traditions that we will study, Blacks are said to be the descendants of Cain. And so his attributes, etc., attached to us. So that'll be our plan for class today. All right. And someone will throw something at me in 40 minutes when it's time for me to stop. Preferably money, right? Couple quick reviews. So in our last class, we began by looking at that blueprint slide that looked at the notion of divine design. And part of the argument that I was making there is it's a common understanding in Christian and Jewish traditions that what we find in creation is God's actual intent. So if we want to see what did God have of God's first thought, if God could have a first thought, go back to the story of creation in Genesis. In particular, look at the first 2 chapters when there was no sin. That gives us a sense of God's original idea. So given that idea that we can find in creation God's original idea, we looked at one place in which racial caste was created. And that was in the famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, of God's actions, right? God creates, God speaks, then God separates light from darkness. Lightness from darkness, as we talked about, quickly becomes racialized, lightness being whiteness, darkness being blackness. So therefore, God created racial segregation from the very beginning. So that becomes part of the theory of how these texts get received over time. If that wasn't fun, we then jump to this question of polygenesis. A long kind of sets of traditions fed into that, and many tributaries flowed out from it. The two that we focused on was this idea in Genesis 1, around verse 23, 24, when we get to the day where God created the beasts of the earth and the creepy crawly things that you may have learned them in Sunday school. One of the arguments was that black folk are among those beasts, or among those animalistic things that God made. So in Genesis 1:26 through 28, when God tells man, male and female, to dominate, to have dominion, one argument becomes that we who are black are among those things to be dominated, because we were not actually human. A second expression of polygenesis was this notion of pre-Adamite or non-Adamite creation. So we talked about it kind of as a preview for today's lecture. Cain gets cast out, goes outside, and finds a wife. And most of us had the question, where'd they come from? Reasonable answer, reasonable question. The Bible's like, that's cute, keep it moving. One of the arguments as to where those other folk came from was that they are non-Adamites. That is, the people that we know from the descendants of Adam and Eve are just one of the kinds of people that God created. Those pre-Adamites then get, in polygenesis world, get devalued humans. So they're not fully human. And so the argument then becomes what Cain and his descendants are these half-breeds. And we'll talk a bit more when we get to the curse of Ham in 2 weeks about kind of all the kind of sexual improprieties that gets read into these texts. So that ends up being part of the polygenesis story. Again, that we are either the beast that to be dominated or non-Adamic creation. So I talked about how these streams both feed into it and then flow from it. So we talked a little bit about the idea that, ironically, the most conservative Christians of the 19th century led the charge to eliminate polygenesis and what I call the monogenesis triumph. That is, they reject the idea that there are non-Adamite humans. One could think, well, then that settles the question. I'm clearly human. Thus my phrase, humanish. Right? And so I ended class last week kind of imagining you straddling a fence with human on the one side, non-human bestial on the other. One of the tributaries that feeds into this idea that even though polygenesis as a doctrine failed, the fact that my humanity was negotiable was a subject of debate for white power. It's part of what the 3/5 compromise was, and we talked about that. The last piece that we didn't get to, which is I always like to take things from the historical to the personal as part of that history, is the story of my grandfather's tale. So as you may remember in the very first class, I mentioned every man in my family, in my immediate family, so my father and his brothers, both grandparents and their brothers, have fought in every war in the 20th century. I'm the first to not go to war as a soldier for this country and my family. My paternal grandfather served in the quartermaster unit overseas in World War I. He didn't talk much about the experience, but one of the great mysteries I learned as a kid is if you sit really quiet, adults will say stuff because they don't think you're listening. It's the greatest hustle I learned as a kid. It serves me well today as well. Sometimes just sit quietly, hear all kinds of stuff that people probably don't think I should know. So free advice. So he and his friends occasionally get together when I was a little child, and they would talk about their stories of being in World War I. They would talk about coming back home and some of the things they would face. And they would talk very soberly, very seriously about this moment that many of them experienced where they would be overseas carrying their rifles in the uniform of the United States. And young white girls would come up to them, Sir, show me your tail. Show me your tail. Tail, right? The thing that dogs and rats have. It was assumed that my grandfather in World War I had one. 30 years later, my maternal grandfather, who would serve in Germany, would come back and hear the same questions from German girls. Then when he came back to the States in Florida, the same questions were asked of him. So yes, monogenesis 1-ish. But we still stand, I argue, somewhat bestial, somewhat human, such that my grandfather serving in war were asked, do you have a tail? That's part of what we were looking at last week, how that lives. Okay. Now, before we move on, if monogenesis wins, and you can't say I'm not a human, I'm human-ish, then you need to find a way of explaining those bestial elements. Be ye not afraid or dismayed. American biblical reception history has an answer for that. And that's what we will look at next. But before we turn to that, I will pause. Questions, comments, concerns, consternations.
Does anyone want to risk using the microphone? There's nothing I can do about it, I'm sorry. Okay, we'll leave it to the experts.
Okay, cool. So, as you're ready to move, the other Dr. Kemp, or some just call her Dr. G and call me Dr. J, to distinguish it, is passing out a little paddle. On one side is a green thumbs up, on the other side is a red thumbs down. So if the statement I say is true, put the green thumbs out towards me. If it's false, put the red thumbs out towards me. We may have to go in pairs because we may not have quite enough. Since we bought it, when the numbers are a little different, so we're awesome that so many are coming. Yeah. So on the screen behind me, does anyone recognize who some of those people are? Yeah. These are comic book heroes or villains. A confession. I have read and watched way too many cartoons for any grown man. And I get thrown out of my hardcore comic book circles because I like DC and I like Marvel. I don't choose between the two. So I have a very good friend. I felt your spirit groan, he said. I have some very close friends who are like, we cannot talk to you about these things. So I confess fully, love comics, and I go both DC and Marvel universe. Hopefully I've not lost your respect too much. But the reason I want to think about them as kind of our backdrop is often when we think about heroes and villains, these are some of the images that come to our minds. So I'm going to make 7 statements. If it's true, hold up the green thumbs up, or if you don't have a paddle, just give me a thumbs up. If it's false, give me a thumbs down. All right? So if you think the statement is true, thumbs up, false, thumbs down. Statement 1, heroes are good. Heroes are good. Okay. All right. The dominant verdict is true. Add a couple people who decided to go against the rules and do a thumb sideways. So I see you. All right. So, question 2, villains are evil. Villains are evil. Okay. All right, thank you. This is kind of a slightly more true, but it was fairly evenly split. Statement 3, heroes do good. Heroes do good. All right, thank you. It's like that was our first unanimous. Statement 4, villains do evil. Villains do evil. Okay, almost all true, a couple of falses. Thank you. Statement 5, heroes should get the benefit of the doubt. Heroes should get the benefit of the doubt. Thumbs up, true, thumbs down, false. I get more people trying to decide. All right, thank you. So majority true with a couple falses and sides. Statement 6, villains should not get the benefit of the doubt. Villains should not get the benefit of the doubt. Okay, so most are saying that's a false statement. Then our seventh one, good whole number. Heroes cannot do evil. Heroes cannot do evil. Okay. Awesome, thank you. So that was another sort of unanimous one. Okay. So, of the 7 statements, are there any ones that jumped out at you like, hey, Dr. Kemp, I want to unpack that more? All Yes, sir. Before you go, we have to pass out the mic because I was told individuals online cannot hear you. So we will.
I apologize in advance for the sound.
Okay, I was worried about giving the right answer, so I just gave the thumbs up, thumb down to my wife so she could be wrong or right. But just your question, way back when, as a period piece at the university I attended, we watched the movie Birth of a Nation. And pretty interesting who the heroes were and who the villains were. So anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think that's part of the conversation of how the commercial for the live white supremacy gets played, right? Who are the heroes? Who are the villains? And how does race then play a part in that, given what we think about heroes and villains? Absolutely. Yes.
Well, I mean, what the suppositions are supposed to be in a comic is different than what this group would come up with, because in a comic book you assume that the heroes are faultless and that the villains are evil, and that completely denies the nuances of things like tragic flaws for the heroes and redemption for the villains.
Right.
So So we can't really vote about this thing.
I think it's unfair to vote. Unfair to vote.
But that's the point. to force that kind of value clarification, if you will, right? To force, if you have to say yes or no, then it allows us to think about what are the things that are driving those associations. Yes, sir.
Would you comment on the diversity of views about who gets the benefit of the doubt?
Sure. Yes. So the question was, could I comment on who gets the benefit of the doubt? So the vast majority of us said heroes should get the benefit of the doubt.
Should I?
Should. Heroes should. So part of the question that we will kind of continue to unpack is, if you are assigned a hero status, how does that relate to the myth of innocence we talked about in the first class? So if there's a presumption, right, in most normal contexts, as a professor, if you stand up in front of a class, they assume you know what you're talking about. If you stand up to preach a sermon as a pastor, they assume you know what you're talking about, which gives you an added responsibility to not mislead people. And if there's something that's off, people say, well, they're a nice guy. So you made the comment in our first class, where you've often heard the stare, yeah, that was bad, but they're a nice guy. Yeah, but she's a nice woman. As though there's immediate caveat. If you think highly of someone, you're more likely to say, well, that was just a bad moment. They aren't bad people. And so that kind of narrative, when that gets racialized through how some of the scriptures we'll be studying gets used, can become very problematic. And so there's a bunch of studies that have been done in the world of law that talk about the presumptions that happen with black defendants and white police officers, and police officers more broadly. And part of that is the benefit of the doubt always falls on one side versus the other. So that's part of thinking about how that plays itself out. And we'll unpack it more when we get to the curse of Ham, because there's an interesting legal moment that comes up in its reception. But that's a 40-second version of that.
What I just wanted to add quickly is it seems to me recently in comic-based movies that you are seeing a much more complex character development and where the heroes struggle mightily and show many more flaws and the villains show, and it suggests or maybe hopefully leads to a more complex appreciation of humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are folk who do film and media studies who have talked about in the last 15 years that shift. So is it Christy? Sorry, I was close. Had talked about kind of the tragic flaws and the possibility of redemption. So what media and film studies will tell you in the last decade or so, that's changed, right? So the other extreme example of this is professional wrestling, right? So, or wrestling, as my grandma would say, where, when I was a kid, Hulk Hogan, what do? We pray, we eat our vitamins, and we work hard in school. Ultimate hero. Fast forward, early 2000s, comes dressed out in black, and is now an ambiguous hero. And sometimes, depending on which week you tune into the program, he's a hero or he's a villain, right? My favorite character, which may say more about me, is actually up here, Batman. Right? Batman is a morally ambiguous hero, right? If you ever watch like Batman versus Superman, those kinds of battles, and again, we're going to nerd out for 10 seconds, I promise. Batman always gets justice, but doesn't always do it the best way. Right? There's a famous scene in one of the Justice Leagues where Superman is trying to interrogate a suspect, and the suspect just laughs at Superman. He's like, you ain't gonna do nothing to me. Then Batman walks up quietly and whispers something, and the guy confesses to every crime in the history of humanity. He was like, this galaxy got extended, I did it, I was wrong. Then everyone asked Superman, what did Batman say? And Superman's response is, you're better off not knowing. Right? So Batman is that morally ambiguous hero. So what does that mean if we start thinking about the complexity of that for human relations in this racial caste system? I forget who said it last week about the separation of light from darkness, that you actually have to talk about there's a transition. That's not purely light, not purely dark, there's a transition period. Was you? Okay. I thought it was you, but you were sitting differently last week. So yeah, keep moving around messes up my mapping. So if now heroes and villains are more on a spectrum, not purely night, not purely darkness, does that mean villains are also on that same spectrum? Not fully dark, not fully light, but somewhere in the middle. And that becomes part of the nuance that develops as we start thinking about these kinds of hierarchies. Now wake up my computer. Cool. Any other kind of thinking thoughts, queries? Yes.
Oh, one of the things when we were kind of voting over here, a number of us were talking about the importance of giving our first instinct, because can be a distinction between what is our instinctual response, kind of our implicit belief. If you're familiar with system 1, system 2 thinking, system 1 is our fast, instantaneous, almost subconscious reaction. And then if we're talking about nuance, That's that slower thought that takes more deliberation that's not always accessible to us all the time. And so that instinctual response is important to recognize as well, that automatic association, because sometimes that drives us more than actually our rational, deliberative thought.
Right, exactly. Right, and I think that becomes important, that system 1, system 2 processing. As, part of my wife's work in clinical psychology involves various parts of neuroscience. So we recognize it's physically too costly to rationally think through everything. We literally don't have the horsepower in our brains to do that. So we have to automate stuff. If a car is speeding at me at 40 miles an hour, I don't have time to calculate mu, the coefficient of friction, omega, the angular momentum. I jump. I ain't got time to process that. And so one of the questions becomes, how do the associations of blackness and whiteness get automated? So that we begin thinking about white and black in automatic ways. That's part of the work that a lot of researchers have done. And part of my contributions to say, and the theological discourse around it has helped build those automated responses. Excellent point. Like, your wife was always right. Excellent. Questions on that before we jump to 2 texts that we want to look at for today? All right. Yes.
Just related to what you're saying, interesting studies appear to be documented extensively that hiring a number of new black police officers into a somewhat unjust or racially biased system makes virtually no difference in outcomes, because the associations and the structural issues in that system don't change, no matter how many black police officers you have. Just kind of sad.
Exactly, and that's part of what we talked about, the effects of the live white supremacy that's always pervaded. So everyone is drinking that water, imbibing that air, being shaped by that gravitational force. So that's part of why it required so much effort to both identify and then counter. Absolutely, absolutely. So can everyone see the scripture on the screen? Thumbs up? Perfect. So like we did last week, I asked if we could just take the mic and read one verse and just go around. So we'll read Genesis chapter 4, and we'll read verses 1 through 12. So Genesis 4, verses 1 through 12. I don't know where the mic is, but we'll just, we'll start there. So you read verse 1.
One verse.
Now the Lord knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have produced a man with the help of the Lord.
Next, she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground.
In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground.
And Abel, for his part, brought of the firstlings of his flock their fat portions, and the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering.
But for Cain and his offering, he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell.
The Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen?
If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it.
Cain said to his brother Abel, let us go out to the field. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him.
Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" He said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?"
And the Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground."
And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand.
When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth.
Thank you. We'll stop there for the moment. So, going back to our heroes and villains slide, who's the hero in those verses? How many say the hero is Cain? How many say the hero is Abel? How many like, there's not really a hero in that story? Okay. Right. So, I'll ask it the other way. Who is the villain in this story? Right. And why is Cain the villain? Right. He kills someone, he kills his brother. Right. Fairly easy, cut and dry. If you kill someone, you're bad. Free public service announcement. Okay? So, often as the Bible does, it leaves a lot of open questions. Why does Cain kill Abel? Right. So one possibility is jealousy. Right. And what is Cain jealous of? Okay. Right. So there's one argument. I think Catherine Darr makes the argument. No, sorry, I'm trying to remember the scholar's name. Catherine Darr makes the argument that Genesis 4 is a case study in bad parenting. So that the villain is really God, because God's a bad parent because he shows partiality towards one child. Wouldn't recommend preaching that, but it's an interesting theory. All right. So jealousy, another possibility is the villain is God. How does Cain learn to murder? How does Cain learn how to kill or how to murder? It's not clear, exactly. Right. Right. How did Cain kill Abel? Yeah, it's not clear, right? He didn't have a 9mm tucked into his tunic, right? We have no idea. So we really don't know why he did it. We're not quite sure how he learned to do it. Is it possible that's a fundamental part of human nature? We're not even sure the mechanism of doing it. All the text tells us is Cain's countenance falls. He's angry, then he kills his brother. 2 linguistic notes. And when I was reading, I was like, why did they do that? But anyway, this is why Dr. Lamont and I, we have fun arguing about English translation. Like, I would never have done it that way. So the verb, I have produced, fine, like you won't fail my class if you translate it that way. But it's the verb kana, which often means to purchase or to acquire. What's interesting about this verse is I have produced or acquired a man. When you give birth, what do you give birth to? A baby. And if it's gender masculine, it's not a man, it's a male. If it's a boy, yes. Or you use the word boy, yeled in Hebrew. So what will happen is scholars will seize upon this idea of what does it mean for her to have acquired a man? In the preview of coming attractions, think polygenesis here. Because this is how this story will turn. And we'll see a move in that direction in the New Testament in a moment. The second linguistic note, she gives birth to his brother Abel. And I always mention this when I do intro Old Testament classes. The meaning of the word Abel comes from the Hebrew word hevel. Hevel means vaporous, ephemeral, something that won't last. So by the time you read the second verse of this, she gave birth to his brother who won't last. Don't get attached to this brother, right? The Hebrew writers tell you early on, he ain't gonna be around for long. So I always tell students, this is why you need to learn Hebrew, because often they'll front load every passage to tell you what's going on. So you get this weird acquiring a man who gives birth to a brother named Fleeting, right? You could stop at verse 2 and I can tell you the rest of the story. Right. Shameless plug for Hebrew. So, Cain emerges as a villain, clearly because he kills people, or his brother in particular, so the particular kind of betrayal. In the reception history of this text, this graphic was in, I think, the first slide, but we didn't get a chance to cover it because it wasn't up on the screen. One of the ways that I think about reception history, right, is that something goes in, a pre-existing tradition, then it goes through some kind of interpretive process. Then what comes out on the other end has some connection to what started, but is not identical to it. Right? I have another slide that has an apple pie in it, but I figured that may be cruel to show apple pie at 10 o'clock in the morning. Don't want to trigger folks' hunger senses. But Cain appears very rarely in the New Testament. The most extended treatment of him is in 1 John 3. So, with time, we can read through that together. So 1 John chapter 3, and we'll read verses 9 through 15. 1 John 3, 9 through 15.
We can go on this side. Would you mind reading?
Those who have been born of God do not sin, because God's seed abides in them.
They cannot sin because they have been born of God.
The children of God and the children of the devil are revealed in this way. All who do not do what is right are not from God, nor are those who do not love their brothers and sisters.
For this is the message you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another.
We must not be like Cain, who was from the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous.
Do not be astonished, brothers and sisters, that the world hates you.
We know that we have passed from death to life because we love one another. Whoever does not love abides in death.
All who hate a brother or sister are murderers. And you know that murderers do not have eternal life abiding in them.
All right, thank you. So I heard a lot of reactions. Yes, sir.
Cain was born with the help of God.
Would you mind restating?
Yeah, the phrase Cain was born with the help of God. Yeah. And when you look at this, that would suggest that he is not from the devil, he's from God. Didn't say anything about Abel being born with the help of God.
Right.
So what's going on there?
Yeah, exactly. Great question. And for me, this is where we can start thinking about how reception history can be analyzed as a way of addressing that question. So in this context, I'll ask the same question. Who is the hero of the Cain and Abel story according to 1 John 3? God, between Cain and Abel. Abel. And how do we know, according to 1 John 3, that Abel was the hero? Right, exactly. His deeds were righteous. As high level as you can get. Is Cain the villain in this story? according to 1 John 3. Yeah. And how do we know Cain is the villain? Right. His deeds are evil. He's from the evil one. Right. He is from. Right. Interesting Greek preposition. Ektompenoro. Right. Of the evil one. And later on in, was it verse 10, the children of God and the children of the devil are revealed in this way. It's suggesting that if you engage in certain kinds of behavior, your origin, to your question, is not godly, but demonic. What did you say? That's not what Genesis 4 says, but that's how it's received in 1 John 3. In part, they were trying to answer the same question we asked. Why did Cain kill Abel? You figure, as a former lawyer or recovering lawyer, motive matters in criminal prosecution. I need to know why you did it. 1 John now gives us an answer. So it's not a priori, it's demonic. It is this false insertion of something evil into the very lineage of Cain. Now, in fairness for 1 John, he's arguing about types of humans. But you've been with me now 3 weeks where you can feel how this could easily turn. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I think it's important to realize that the writer of 1 John was writing in a completely different context from the writers of Genesis.
Absolutely.
And to me, an intriguing question is whether or not there is a development of a sense of morality and an understanding of that goes deeper, and particularly in light of the fact that this is from the Christian scripture. It seems to me that it is just a completely different take on what the original writer was trying to say.
Right. And it's as if you read my mind. So part of this question of how we get here from the text is we learn a couple things through early Jewish interpretations of this. So I highlighted two concepts: the acquirement of a man, and then that Cain gets cursed. In Genesis, prior to Genesis 4:11, who else gets cursed? Yeah, someone said it. The serpent. Now, in Christian traditions, who do we understand the serpent to be? All right, the devil or Satan. So by the time 1 John is writing, the first thing cursed was the serpent, who is the devil. See Revelation 12 for that syllogism. The next thing that's cursed is Cain. So they ask the question, is there a relationship between the first thing God cursed and the second thing God cursed? 1 John 3 says, yes, they are both of the evil one or of the devil. So Cain becomes a part of this devilish tradition. Because that explains why murder enters the world. So if New Testament scholars are right, and I have no reason to disagree with them, the same community that produced 1 John produced the Gospel of John. And in my vacation Bible school, we used to have those Bible sword drills. And this is one of the passages do they do that too? Some of you had, all right. So you feel me on the Bible sword drills. And one of the ones we had to find was in John. The devil comes only to steal, to kill, and to destroy. So the devil's actions are about stealing, killing, and destroy. What does Cain do? He kills. So therefore, what is Cain? Right, he's of the devil. Another way 1 John gets this tradition is going back to this question of acquiring a man. A strange formulation. So there develops a tradition that 1 John might be aware of. A couple scholars agree with me in my hypothesis, so I can share it. There's a tradition that develops in Jewish ideas that Eve is the mother of Cain, but Adam is not his father. Right, not God. Yes, that's a perfect modern metaphor. He was Rosemary's baby. So that Eve, who falls through sin, and we can play with what knowledge and knowing means in Hebrew, her next sin is a sexual one. And that's why Cain comes out not as a boy, but as a man. Because he is a hybrid. He is Rosemary's baby of a demon and Eve. And therefore, their different origins of darkness and of light means Cain has to exterminate the light, which is why Abel doesn't last long. Right, so the question was, if God helped her do that, why is then Cain evil? One answer to that question, and I'm not wholly satisfied with it, but it's one answer that comes up in the literature, is to argue for God's help is different than arguing for God's endorsement. So as I said, I'm not persuaded by it, but it's the one that you'll hear a lot in literature. God's help is different than God's endorsement. The argument of why it's help, not endorsement, is to suggest that God is not in absolute control, challenges God's sovereignty. So therefore, they use this as a phrase to do that. Oh, I meant like a minute. Yes. Right. The rabbis have an answer for that. But I was just told we were actually over time. So I will stop there, which is an odd cliffhanger. But we'll stop there. We'll pick this up and then how this thing transitions into racialization. So thank you all for your time.